The hem of her white cotton dress trembled against the red clay dust. Ruth Holloway knelt on the limestone steps of First Baptist Church. Her 4-year-old daughter Emily pressed against her side, while Reverend Dale Pritchard stood in the doorway, with his arms crossed and his jaw set like concrete. Inside the sanctuary, 73 folding chairs sat empty, waiting for a wedding that would never happen. The August heat in Valdosta, Georgia pressed down like a hand on the back of the neck. Humid, relentless, thick enough to taste. Cicadas screamed from the live oaks that ringed the church parking lot, their song rising and falling in waves. The smell of cut grass and honeysuckle hung in the air, sweet and cloying, mixing with the faint diesel exhaust from Route 41 where trucks rolled past, oblivious to the small tragedy unfolding in their wake. Ruth's hands shook as she held the marriage license she'd saved 3 months to afford. $28. A fortune on a diner waitress's salary. "Please," she whispered, looking up at the Reverend. "Please, just let us inside. James is waiting. The guests are coming. Everything's ready." Pritchard's expression didn't soften. He was a thin man in his 50s, all sharp angles and Sunday righteousness, the kind who measured faith in attendance records and tithing envelopes. His white shirt was starched stiff, his black tie knotted tight despite the heat. "I've made my position clear, Miss Holloway." He emphasized the miss like a weapon. "This church sanctifies holy unions between men and women of good moral standing. You come here with a child, born out of wedlock, asking to marry a man who is not her father, and you expect me to bless that arrangement before God and this community." Emily whimpered, burying her face in Ruth's side. The girl wore a yellow dress Ruth had sewn by hand, tiny white flowers embroidered around the collar. She'd worked on it every night for 2 weeks after her shifts at Mabel's diner ended, fingers raw from the needle. "Emily's father died before we could marry," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "Vietnam. He never even knew I was pregnant. That doesn't make her a mistake. That doesn't make me unworthy." But even as she spoke, Ruth felt the old shame rising in her throat. The shame that had followed her for 4 years, through hospital corridors where nurses whispered, through grocery store aisles where women pulled their children aside, through job interviews where decent employers found reasons not to hire her. The shame that James had promised to erase. James Monroe, the mechanic who'd fixed her car last spring and stayed to fix her life. Who'd proposed 3 months ago on one knee in her tiny kitchen, holding a simple gold band and looking at her like she was something precious. Who'd told Emily she could call him Daddy if she wanted to. Who was supposed to be meeting her here at 11:30 on this Saturday morning to become her husband. "Where virtue is absent," Pritchard said coldly, "the church cannot offer sanctuary. I suggest you find a justice of the peace, or better yet, reflect on the choices that brought you to this moment." He stepped back inside and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The sound echoed across the empty parking lot like a gunshot. Ruth stayed on her knees, too stunned to move. Around her, the Georgia morning blazed indifferent and bright. A mockingbird called from somewhere in the oaks. A car horn honked on the highway. Emily tugged at her sleeve. "Mama, why won't he let us in? Did I do something bad?" The question broke something in Ruth's chest. She pulled her daughter close, breathing in the smell of her hair, baby shampoo and sunshine, and felt tears burn hot down her cheeks. "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong. You're perfect." But the words felt hollow, because if Emily wasn't wrong, then Ruth was, and she'd spent 4 years believing exactly that. She heard gravel crunching under tires and looked up, expecting James's blue Ford. Instead, an old pickup truck rolled into the lot. Faded green paint, rusted wheel wells, a cracked windshield held together with tape. The engine coughed twice before shutting off. The driver's door opened and a man climbed out. Ruth had seen him before. Everyone in Valdosta had. Thomas Webb, the farmer who owned 200 acres of pecan groves east of town. Late 50s, weathered face, hands like gnarled roots. He kept to himself mostly, sold his harvest at the farmer's market, attended church on Christmas and Easter, but never spoke much to anyone. He wore clean work clothes, denim shirt, canvas pants, boots caked with red mud, and he walked toward her with the slow deliberation of a man who'd made a decision and wouldn't be turned from it. Ruth wiped her eyes quickly, trying to compose herself. "Mr. Webb, I'm sorry. There's no wedding. You don't need to." "I heard what happened," he said quietly. His voice was low and rough, like gravel shifted by water. "Heard it from my farmhand's wife, who heard it from her sister at the post office. Small towns talk fast." He looked at the closed church door, then back at Ruth. Something shifted in his expression, a hardness settling into place. "I need to speak with Reverend Pritchard." Before Ruth could respond, Thomas walked past her and knocked on the church door. 3 solid strikes that rattled the frame. Pritchard opened it almost immediately, his face already arranged in dismissal. "Mr. Webb, this is a private matter between—" "You turned away Ruth Holloway." It wasn't a question. Thomas's voice cut through Pritchard's rehearsed speech like a blade through paper. "I made a pastoral decision based on shame." Thomas stepped closer, close enough that Pritchard had to look up to meet his eyes. "Based on judging a woman for circumstances beyond her control. Based on forgetting what grace actually means." Pritchard's face flushed red. "I will not be lectured on theology by a farmer who attends service twice a year." "Then let me speak plainly." Thomas's voice dropped lower, but somehow carried more weight. 3 years ago, the Oconee River flooded my land, took out my irrigation system, my barn, half my pecan trees. I was 3 months from bankruptcy. Ruth Holloway, this woman you just turned away from God's house, she heard about it at the diner where she works. You know what she did?" Pritchard said nothing. "She organized a fundraiser, got every regular at Mabel's to contribute, waited tables for free for 2 weeks and donated every tip, brought me $742 in a coffee tin, wouldn't take no for an answer. Said people look out for each other. That's how communities survive." Thomas turned to look at Ruth, who was staring at him with wide eyes, Emily still clutched against her side. "She saved my farm, my livelihood, my future, and she did it while raising a child alone, working double shifts, living in a 1-room apartment above the hardware store." He turned back to Pritchard. "So before you tell me she's unworthy of standing in that church, you better explain to me what worthiness looks like. Because from where I stand, she's shown more Christian charity than half the congregation combined." The parking lot had gone silent except for the cicadas and the distant highway hum. Pritchard's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. And that's when the first car pulled into the lot, old Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop, followed by the Kowalski family in their station wagon, then 3 more vehicles, guests arriving for a wedding they didn't know had been canceled. But they were about to find out. And what happened next would be talked about in Valdosta for the next 40 years. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if this story's already grabbed you, Hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss where this goes. Mrs. Henderson climbed out of her Buick holding a bouquet of white roses wrapped in green tissue paper. She was 71 years old, had run Henderson's Flowers on Main Street for 43 years, and had never missed a wedding invitation in her life. She took one look at Ruth kneeling on the church steps with tears on her face, and Emily pressed against her side, then at Reverend Pritchard standing in the doorway with his arms still crossed, and her expression went from confusion to comprehension to quiet fury in the space of 3 heartbeats. "Dale Pritchard," she said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What in God's name is going on here?" Behind her, car doors slammed as more guests arrived. The Kowalskis, Ed and Margaret with their 3 boys, all dressed in their Sunday best. Bobby Chen, who worked the register at the hardware store. The Williamson sisters, both school teachers, both spinsters, both pillars of the ladies' auxiliary. James Monroe's cousin Danny and his wife, carrying a wrapped gift, all of them stopping mid-stride when they saw Ruth on the steps, all of them looking between her and the Reverend, reading the scene like a sentence already written. Pritchard straightened his shoulders. "This is a church matter, Eleanor. It doesn't concern—" "I was invited to a wedding," Mrs. Henderson interrupted. "Ruth Holloway asked me to do the flowers. I spent 2 hours this morning arranging centerpieces, so I'd say it concerns me quite a bit." She turned to Ruth. "Sweetheart, what happened?" Ruth's voice came out small and broken. "He won't let us in. Says I'm not worthy." The word hung in the humid air like smoke. Margaret Kowalski made a sound low in her throat, half gasp, half growl. She marched straight past Pritchard into the church and emerged 30 seconds later, carrying one of the flower arrangements Mrs. Henderson had dropped off earlier. She set it on the hood of her station wagon with exaggerated care. "Ed," she said to her husband, "get the rest of them. We're moving this wedding." Ed blinked. "Moving it where?" "Anywhere that isn't here." The Kowalski boys, aged 7, 9, and 11, immediately understood they were witnessing something important and stood perfectly still, watching their mother with wide eyes. Thomas Webb, who'd been standing silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "My farm, half a mile east on County Road 12. There's a pecan grove with enough shade for 70 people. The ground's solid. We can set up chairs in 20 minutes. Ruth looked up at him, stunned. "Mr. Webb, you can't—" "Yes, I can." He met her eyes with absolute certainty. "And I am." Pritchard stepped forward, his face flushed darker now. "This is absurd. You can't simply relocate a wedding ceremony to a field like some sort of barn dance. Marriage is a sacred institution that requires proper what?" Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through his protest like scissors through ribbon. "Proper judgment? Proper cruelty? You want to talk about sacred institutions, Dale? Let's talk about charity. Let's talk about compassion. Let's talk about the part in Scripture where Christ says, 'Let he who is without sin cast the first stone.'" She wasn't shouting. Somehow that made it worse. Pritchard's jaw worked silently. Bobby Chen from the hardware store cleared his throat. "Ruth pays her rent on time, never asks for extensions, keeps that apartment cleaner than most houses I've seen. Emily's a good kid, polite, doesn't break things in the store." He shrugged. "Don't see what the problem is." One of the Williamson sisters, the older one, Charlotte, added quietly. "She volunteers at the library every Thursday evening, reads to the children during story hour, does it for free." Her sister Anna nodded. "Emily sits in the front row every time. Sweetest thing you've ever seen." These were small testimonies, ordinary kindnesses observed by ordinary people, But together they formed a picture that Pritchard couldn't erase with dogma or shame, and still more cars were pulling into the lot. The Johnsons, the Ramirez family, old Mr. Patterson, who had to be 85 and used a cane but who'd driven himself here because James Monroe had fixed his tractor for free last winter. They climbed out of their vehicles and stood in a loose semicircle, silent witnesses to something shifting, some invisible line in the red clay dust that divided before from after. Emily tugged Ruth's sleeve. "Mama, who are all these people?" They're our friends, baby." Ruth hadn't realized she had so many. She rose slowly to her feet, her white dress dusty at the knees, and looked at the faces surrounding her. Some she knew well. Some she only recognized from passing on the street. But all of them had stopped their Saturday morning plans to come here, to this moment, to bear witness to her happiness. And now they were choosing, one by one, to bear witness to something else, to defiance. Margaret Kowalski was already directing her husband and sons to start unloading chairs from the church vestibule. "Carefully, boys. Don't scuff the varnish." Thomas turned to Ruth. "I'll go ahead and mark out the space. You follow when you're ready. Take your time." He walked toward his truck, then paused and looked back at Pritchard one last time. "You had a chance to show grace today, Reverend. Remember that." Then he climbed into his faded green pickup and drove away, trailing dust. Mrs. Henderson handed Ruth the bouquet of white roses. "These are yours, dear. Don't you dare leave them behind." Ruth took the flowers with trembling hands. They smelled like hope and summer mornings, delicate and impossibly fragile. Pritchard stood alone on the church steps now, watching his congregation dismantle his authority one folding chair at a time. His face had gone pale beneath the flush, and his hands hung at his sides like dead weights. "This is irregular," he said, weakly. "This is against protocol." Nobody answered him, because the truth that was becoming clear to everyone in that parking lot, was that protocol had failed. That rules built on shame and judgment couldn't hold against the simple human instinct to protect someone who'd been wronged. The convoy formed slowly. Mrs. Henderson's Buick in front, followed by the Kowalski's station wagon loaded with chairs, then the rest of the guests in their various vehicles, all pulling out of the First Baptist Church parking lot in a slow procession that felt less like a wedding party and more like a quiet revolution. Ruth stood beside her own car, a battered Chevy Nova with rust spots on the hood, and watched them go. Emily was already buckled into the passenger seat, her yellow dress bright against the cracked vinyl. "Mama?" the girl asked through the open window. "Are we still getting married?" Ruth looked at her daughter's face, so trusting, so certain that the world could still be good, and felt something fierce and unbreakable settle in her chest. "Yes, baby. We are." She slid behind the wheel and turned the key. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. As she pulled onto County Road 12, following the line of cars ahead, Ruth glanced in the rearview mirror. Pritchard was still standing on the church steps, a solitary figure in black and white, growing smaller and smaller until the live oaks swallowed him completely. She didn't look back again. Ahead, the road stretched out beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The pecan groves rose on either side, their branches heavy with summer growth. And somewhere at the end of that red clay road, a farmer was preparing to give a stranger the wedding she'd been denied. But there was still one person missing. James Monroe, the groom who should have been at the church an hour ago. The man Ruth was supposed to marry. And as the convoy rolled toward Thomas Webb's farm, Nobody, not Ruth, not the guests, not even Thomas himself, knew that James was sitting in a holding cell at the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office, arrested on charges he didn't commit, put there by people who wanted to make absolutely certain this wedding never happened. The pecan grove smelled like earth and shade, and something older than memory. Thomas Webb's farm spread across 200 acres of red Georgia clay, but the heart of it, the part that mattered, was this half-acre of trees planted by his grandfather in 1927. The branches interlaced overhead like cathedral vaulting, filtering the August sun into coins of light that shifted across the ground with every breath of wind. By the time Ruth's Chevy Nova pulled up the gravel drive, 20 people were already setting up chairs in neat rows between the trees. Ed Kowalski and his oldest son carried a folding table that would serve as the altar. Mrs. Henderson directed the placement of flower arrangements with the precision of a field general. The Williamson sisters spread a white tablecloth across a makeshift gift table. Bobby Chen was stringing extension cords from Thomas's workshop to power a portable speaker system someone had thought to bring. It looked nothing like a church. It looked better. Ruth climbed out of the Nova and stood for a moment, taking it in. Emily had already run off to join the Kowalski boys, who were chasing each other around the tree trunks in their dress clothes, laughing with the careless joy that only children could summon in the middle of adult chaos. Thomas approached from the direction of the farmhouse, carrying 2 sawhorses and a wide plank of sanded pine. "Thought you might want something to stand on," he said. "Ground's a bit uneven. Mr. Webb, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't need thanks. Just need you to be happy." He set down the sawhorses and positioned the plank across them, testing its stability. "That's payment enough." Ruth watched him work, the careful, methodical movements of a man who'd spent his life building things with his hands. There was something deeply steady about him, something that made the world feel less chaotic just by proximity. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly. "Really doing it, I mean. It can't just be about the fundraiser." Thomas straightened and looked at her. His eyes were the color of creek water in winter, gray-green and impossibly clear. "My wife died 6 years ago. Cancer. We never had children. She couldn't carry to term, lost 3 before the doctors told us to stop trying." He spoke matter-of-factly, as if these were simply facts to be stated rather than griefs to be performed. "After she passed, I figured my life was done. Not over, just done. I'd work the farm, sell the harvest, exist until I didn't anymore." He picked up a stray twig from the ground and turned it between his fingers. Then the flood came, lost almost everything. "And Ruth, you didn't just bring me money. You reminded me that people still give a damn. That kindness isn't extinct, that I wasn't as alone as I thought I was." He met her eyes again. "So when I heard what Pritchard did to you, I thought, here's a woman who gave me hope when I had none, and some self-righteous fool is trying to take hers away. That doesn't sit right with me. Won't sit right with me. Ever." The confession hung between them in the dappled shade. Ruth felt tears threatening again, but these were different. Not shame or despair, but something closer to gratitude so profound it had nowhere to go except out. "James should be here by now," she said, glancing toward the road. "He was supposed to meet me at the church at 11:30. It's almost noon." Thomas frowned. "You call him?" "He doesn't have a phone at the shop. I could drive over. I'll go." Thomas was already moving toward his truck. "You stay here, get ready. He probably just lost track of time working on an engine. You know how mechanics are." But Ruth saw something flicker across his face, A shadow of doubt, maybe, or concern. Before she could ask, he was gone, the green pickup kicking up dust as it rattled back down the drive toward town. Margaret Kowalski appeared at Ruth's elbow, holding a compact mirror and a tube of lipstick. "Here, you're getting married in 20 minutes and you look like you've been crying." "I have been crying." "Well, stop it now. You'll ruin your makeup." Margaret's tone was brisk but kind. She dabbed at Ruth's face with a handkerchief, then applied fresh lipstick with practiced efficiency. "There. Beautiful." Ruth looked at her reflection in the compact. Eyes red-rimmed but clear. Hair still pinned despite the morning's chaos. The white dress only slightly dusty at the hem. She looked like a woman about to get married. She looked like a woman who'd fought for the right to get married. "Margaret," she said quietly, "why did you help me? You barely know me." Margaret snapped the compact shut. "I know you well enough. I know you work 2 jobs to keep a roof over your daughter's head. I know you never complain. I know Emily's in my youngest son's class, and his teacher says she's kind to the other kids, shares her crayons, helps the ones who can't read yet." She shrugged. "That tells me everything I need to know about how you're raising her. And if Dale Pritchard can't see that, then Dale Pritchard's a fool." She handed Ruth the lipstick. "Keep it. You might need a touch-up after you kiss your husband." The word sent a thrill through Ruth's chest. Husband. If James ever showed up. By 12:15, the chairs were arranged, the flowers were placed, the makeshift altar was sturdy, and 47 people stood in the pecan grove, waiting for a groom who hadn't arrived. Emily tugged at Ruth's hand. "Mama, where's James?" "He'll be here soon, baby." But Ruth's voice sounded hollow even to herself. Mrs. Henderson approached, her expression concerned. "Ruth, dear, should we delay? Give him a bit more time?" Before Ruth could answer, Thomas's truck appeared at the end of the drive, moving faster than before. It skidded to a stop near the grove, and Thomas jumped out, his face grim. He walked straight to Ruth, and she knew, before he even opened his mouth, that something was wrong. "He's in jail," Thomas said quietly. "James. They arrested him this morning." The world tilted. "What? For what?" "Theft. Someone reported that tools went missing from Henderson's hardware last week, and they found them in the back of James's shop. Deputy says it's an open and shut case." Bobby Chen, who'd been adjusting the speaker system, spun around. "That's impossible. I do inventory every Friday. Nothing's missing." Thomas nodded. "I know. I talked to Sheriff Watkins, told him the same thing, but the deputy who made the arrest is new. Fellow named Crenshaw, transferred in from Macon last month. He's not listening to anyone." Ruth felt the pieces clicking together in her mind, slow and terrible, like bones breaking one by one. "Someone set him up. That's my guess." "Who would do that?" Thomas hesitated, then said carefully, "Dale Pritchard's brother-in-law is on the county council, has connections at the sheriff's office. I'm not saying it was him, but..." He didn't need to finish. Ruth looked around at the assembled guests, at the pecan grove transformed into a wedding venue, at Emily standing nearby with confusion written across her small face. All of this effort, all this kindness, all this defiant hope, and it still wasn't enough. Because power didn't play fair. Power played to win. "What do we do?" Mrs. Henderson asked, and Ruth realized the question was directed at her. Everyone was looking at her, waiting for her to decide. Ruth thought about the $742 she'd raised for Thomas Webb 3 years ago. Thought about the double shifts and the sore feet and the way people had come together because she'd asked them to. Thought about the small, persistent belief that goodness could triumph if you just worked hard enough, cared deeply enough, refused to give up. She'd believed that once. She wanted to believe it still. "We go get him," Ruth said. Her voice was steady, unbreakable. "We go to the sheriff's office and we get James out, and we come back here, and we get married." Thomas smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him all day. "All right then, let's go." But as they turned toward the trucks, none of them knew that Deputy Crenshaw wasn't working alone, that the frame job had been carefully orchestrated, that bail had been set deliberately high, $500 more than Ruth could possibly afford, and that the people who wanted this wedding stopped weren't done yet. Not even close. The Lowndes County Sheriff's Office sat on Pine Street like a brick-and-mortar rebuke to optimism. Single-story, flat roof, windows barred with iron grills that turned the interior into a cage of shadows. The American flag hanging from the pole out front drooped in the windless heat, and the parking lot smelled like hot asphalt and stale coffee grounds from the dumpster around back. Thomas's truck led the convoy. Ruth in the passenger seat, Emily buckled between them. Behind came Mrs. Henderson's Buick, then the Kowalski's station wagon, then 6 more vehicles filled with wedding guests who'd decided that getting a groom out of jail was apparently part of the day's itinerary. They pulled into the lot like an occupying force. Sheriff Marcus Watkins stood on the front steps, a heavy-set man in his early 60s with iron-gray hair and a face that had seen enough trouble to recognize it coming from a quarter-mile away. He watched the vehicles park with the expression of someone watching floodwaters rise. Ruth climbed out first, her white dress bright against the dull brick. Emily stayed close to her side, small hand gripping her mother's with fierce determination. "Sheriff Watkins," Ruth said. "I need to see James Monroe." Watkins sighed and removed his hat, wiping sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief. "Miss Holloway, I understand you're upset, but there's procedure here. Your fiancé was arrested on legitimate charges. Bobby Chen is right here." Ruth gestured to the hardware store clerk, who'd climbed out of his vehicle and was walking toward them. "Ask him if anything's missing from his inventory." Watkins looked at Bobby. "Well?" "Nothing's missing, Sheriff. I checked this morning after I heard about the arrest. Every tool accounted for." "Then where did the stolen items in Monroe's shop come from?" Bobby spread his hands. "Someone planted them. Only explanation that makes sense." Watkins's jaw tightened. He wasn't a stupid man. Ruth could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, the calculations being made. He knew something was wrong with this arrest, but admitting it meant admitting his department had been used as a weapon in someone else's vendetta. And that was dangerous territory. "I'll need to investigate further," he said carefully. "But in the meantime, bail's been set at $500. If you can post that, Monroe walks." $500. Ruth felt the number hit her like a physical blow. She had $43 in her purse. Her entire savings, set aside over 9 months for the wedding, was $87 hidden in a coffee can under her bed. She couldn't make bail. She couldn't save him. The realization settled over her like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. "That's excessive for a first offense on a misdemeanor charge," Thomas said quietly. "You know it is, Marcus." Watkins met his eyes. "Bail amount wasn't my decision. Deputy Crenshaw processed the arrest." "Where is Crenshaw?" "Inside, finishing paperwork." Thomas started toward the door. Watkins moved to block him, but something in the farmer's expression made him step aside. The interior of the sheriff's office was exactly what Ruth expected. Scuffed linoleum, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, a counter separating the public area from the administrative section where two desks sat buried under paperwork. The smell of burnt coffee and old cigarette smoke clung to everything. Deputy Frank Crenshaw looked up from his desk as they entered. He was young, maybe 30, with the smooth, unmarked face of someone who'd never been punched hard enough to learn humility. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to a mirror shine. "Help you folks?" he asked, not standing. "You arrested James Monroe this morning," Thomas said. "On what evidence?" Crenshaw leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his stomach. "Anonymous tip came in yesterday. Caller said Monroe was fencing stolen tools out of his shop. We obtained a warrant, executed a search, found the items exactly where the tipster said they'd be. Pretty straightforward. Who was the tipster? Anonymous means anonymous. And you didn't think it was suspicious that this tip came in the day before Monroe's wedding?" Crenshaw's expression didn't change. "Coincidences happen." Ruth stepped forward. "Please, I'm begging you. James didn't steal anything. Someone's trying to ruin our wedding." "Ma'am, I understand you're emotional." "Don't." Ruth's voice cut through his condescension like a blade. "Don't you dare tell me I'm emotional. I'm standing here in my wedding dress, asking you to do your job properly. That's not emotion. That's desperation." For the first time, Crenshaw looked uncomfortable. He glanced past Ruth to the crowd of people filling the small office. Mrs. Henderson, the Kowalskis, Bobby Chen, the Williamson sisters, all of them watching him with expressions that ranged from disappointment to barely contained fury. "I'm sorry," he said, but his tone suggested he wasn't. "Bail is $500. That's the law." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, opening her purse. "I have $60. Margaret Kowalski pulled out her wallet. "45 here." Bobby Chen checked his pockets. 32. One by one, the wedding guests came forward. Crumpled bills and loose change, pulled from purses and wallets and jacket pockets. The Williamson sisters contributed $80 between them, most of their monthly grocery budget. Ed Kowalski emptied his wallet completely. Old Mr. Patterson, the man with the cane, produced a $100 bill from an envelope in his shirt pocket. "Was saving this for my granddaughter's birthday," he said, "but she'll understand." They piled the money on the counter, a heap of wrinkled bills and coins that smelled like leather and lint and faith in humanity. Thomas counted it twice. $417, $83 short. The room went silent except for the buzz of the fluorescent lights. Ruth stared at the pile of money, more generosity than she'd ever received in her life, more kindness than she'd thought existed, and knew it wasn't enough. Emily tugged at her dress. "Mama, can I help?" The girl reached into the small purse she'd been carrying, a child's purse, plastic and yellow with a broken clasp, and pulled out a $5 bill. "Daddy James gave this to me last week for ice cream," Emily said, "but I didn't spend it. I was saving it for something special." Ruth couldn't breathe, couldn't speak, could only watch as her 4-year-old daughter placed the $5 bill on top of the pile with the solemnity of someone performing a sacred ritual. Thomas picked up the bill gently, added it to the count. $422. Still 78 short. He stood there for a long moment, looking at the money, at the faces surrounding him, at Ruth in her white dress with tears streaming down her cheeks. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. Inside was a single $100 bill, tucked into a hidden compartment, creased and worn from years of carrying. "My wife gave me this the day before she died," Thomas said quietly. "Told me to spend it on something that made me happy. I've been carrying it for 6 years, never found the right thing." He placed it on the pile. "This is the right thing." $522, more than enough. Crenshaw stared at the money, his face unreadable. He couldn't refuse it. The amount was there. The bail was met. But accepting it meant releasing Monroe, meant letting this wedding happen, meant failing whoever had paid him to make this arrest. And Ruth saw it in his eyes, the moment he made his choice. "Fine," Crenshaw said. "I'll process the release." He swept the money into a drawer and disappeared into the back, where the holding cells waited. Thomas reached over and took Ruth's hand, squeezed it once. They'd won. But as they waited for James to emerge, none of them noticed the black sedan that had been parked across the street for the past 20 minutes. None of them saw the man inside reach for his car phone. And none of them knew that Reverend Dale Pritchard had just been informed that his plan had failed, which meant he was about to try something more desperate. James Monroe walked out of the holding cell looking like a man who'd been dragged through a nightmare backward. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair stood at odd angles, and there was a bruise forming along his left cheekbone where he'd apparently been shoved against the cell bars during processing. But his eyes, when they found Ruth standing in the sheriff's office waiting area, went from exhausted to blazing with relief in the span of a single heartbeat. Ruth. She crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and threw her arms around his neck. He caught her, held her tight, buried his face in her hair, and breathed like a drowning man breaking the surface. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, I'm so sorry. I tried to call the church, but they wouldn't let me use the phone, and Crenshaw kept saying the charges were serious and I'd be processed when they got around to it, and—" "Shh. It's okay. You're out now. The wedding is waiting for you." James pulled back enough to look at her face, then at the crowd of people standing behind her. His expression moved through confusion, recognition, and finally something close to wonder. "You all came here to bail me out?" "We came to get our groom," Mrs. Henderson said firmly. "Can't have a wedding without one." James looked at Thomas Webb, who stood near the counter with his hands in his pockets and a quiet satisfaction on his weathered face. "Mr. Webb, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me. Thank your bride. She's the one who wouldn't give up." James turned back to Ruth, and the expression on his face made her heart ache. Love and gratitude and disbelief that someone would fight this hard for him. "Let's go get married," she said. They walked out of the sheriff's office into the afternoon sun, now past 1 o'clock, the heat climbing toward its daily peak. The convoy reassembled in the parking lot, engines starting in sequence like a mechanical choir. But as they prepared to leave, Sheriff Watkins appeared on the steps again. "Miss Holloway, a word." Ruth tensed, but Thomas touched her arm. "I'll be right here." She walked back to where Watkins stood, his expression troubled. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I had nothing to do with setting that bail amount. Crenshaw acted on his own authority, or someone else's authority running through him. I believe you. I've been sheriff here for 23 years. I know Dale Pritchard, know his family, know the kind of influence they have." He met her eyes. "You need to be careful. Men like that don't take kindly to being defied in public." "Are you saying he's dangerous?" "I'm saying he's connected, and connected men have ways of making problems disappear." Watkins hesitated, then added, "There's been talk around town about you and Monroe, about whether this marriage is appropriate." Ruth felt the old shame trying to resurface, that familiar weight pressing down on her chest. Who's talking? Does it matter? Small towns are made of talk. But his tone suggested he knew exactly who was spreading the poison. "Just watch yourself. Both of you." He tipped his hat and walked back inside. Ruth returned to the convoy feeling like a target had been painted on her back. The drive back to Thomas Webb's farm should have been triumphant. They had the groom. They had the guests. They had overcome every obstacle thrown in their path. But Ruth couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. Some invisible sword hanging overhead, waiting to drop. Emily sat between her and James in the Chevy Nova, chattering excitedly about the pecan grove and the flowers, and how she was going to stand right next to them during the ceremony. James held Ruth's hand across the girl's yellow dress, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Just tired. We can postpone. Do this another day when—" "No." Ruth's response was immediate and fierce. "We're doing this today. Now. I'm not giving them another chance to stop us." James studied her profile. "Who's them?" Ruth didn't answer because she wasn't entirely sure herself. Pritchard, certainly. Crenshaw. The anonymous tipster. The people in town who whispered about unwed mothers and inappropriate marriages. The entire system that judged her unworthy based on a single mistake made in grief and loneliness 5 years ago. All of them. And none of them. The convoy pulled into Thomas's farm at 1:47 in the afternoon. The pecan grove waited exactly as they'd left it. Chairs arranged, flowers positioned, the makeshift altar standing solid in the dappled shade. But something was different. More people had arrived. At least 30 additional guests stood among the trees, people Ruth didn't recognize from the original invitation list. Mrs. Patterson from the post office, the Nguyen family who ran the dry cleaners, 3 nurses from the county hospital still wearing their scrubs, a cluster of farmers who worked land adjacent to Thomas's property. Word had spread. The story of the church rejection, the jail arrest, the community response. It had moved through Valdosta like wildfire through dry grass, and people had come to witness the ending. "Lord have mercy," James breathed. "There must be 100 people here." Thomas walked over to meet them, a quiet pride in his expression. "Turns out folks like a good underdog story, and they don't much appreciate the way you two were treated." Ruth climbed out of the Nova and stood looking at the assembled crowd. Strangers and friends, old and young, people from every corner of Valdosta society. They'd come in their work clothes and Sunday best, carrying casseroles and gifts and the simple desire to be part of something that mattered, to stand up for something right. Margaret Kowalski appeared with a hairbrush and fresh lipstick. "5 minutes to touch up. Then we're starting this wedding before anything else goes wrong." She shepherded Ruth behind Thomas's workshop, where someone had set up a small mirror on a sawhorse. Ruth fixed her hair with shaking hands, reapplied makeup, brushed the dust from her dress. Through the workshop window, she could see James talking with Ed Kowalski, the 2 men laughing about something. She could see Emily playing with the other children, her yellow dress bright among the pecan trees. She could see Thomas adjusting the speaker system one final time. Everything was ready. Everyone was waiting. Ruth stepped out from behind the workshop and walked toward the grove. The assembled guests turned to watch her, and a hush fell across the crowd. Someone started humming "Here Comes the Bride," off-key but earnest, and others joined in until the melody filled the space between the trees like birdsong. James stood at the makeshift altar, his bruised face split with a smile so wide it looked painful. Emily ran to take Ruth's hand, appointed herself as flower girl without anyone asking, and Ruth walked down an aisle of red Georgia clay, past faces beaming with joy and defiance, toward the man who'd promised to love her despite everything the world said about her worthiness. She was halfway there when she heard the vehicles approaching. 3 cars coming fast up the gravel drive, kicking up dust clouds that rose like smoke signals. The first car was a black sedan. The second was Reverend Dale Pritchard's silver Cadillac. And the third was a patrol car from the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office. The music stopped, the crowd turned, and Ruth understood, with the cold clarity of someone who'd been fighting uphill her entire life, that this wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. The vehicles stopped at the edge of the pecan grove in a deliberate formation, blocking the exit, Ruth noted with rising dread. Reverend Dale Pritchard climbed out of the Cadillac first, dressed in his full clerical vestments despite the August heat. Behind him came 2 men Ruth didn't recognize, one in an expensive gray suit carrying a briefcase, the other wearing the casual menace of hired muscle wrapped in cheap polyester. Deputy Crenshaw emerged from the patrol car, his hand resting on his service weapon with theatrical significance. And from the black sedan came a woman in her 50s, silver hair pulled into a severe bun, wearing pearls and judgment in equal measure. Thomas Webb stepped forward, positioning himself between the newcomers and the wedding party. "This is private property, Dale. You're not invited." Pritchard's smile was thin and cold. "I'm here on official church business. And Mrs. Vera Holloway," he gestured to the silver-haired woman, "has some concerns about the welfare of her granddaughter." Ruth's world stopped. Vera Holloway, her former mother-in-law, the woman who'd disowned her when she'd gotten pregnant, who'd called her a disgrace to the family name, who'd sworn 5 years ago that Ruth would never see a penny of her dead son's veteran benefits, never receive acknowledgement, never be anything but a shameful secret. "Mama?" Emily whispered, pressing closer to Ruth's side. Vera walked forward with the careful steps of someone navigating a minefield. Her eyes swept across the assembled crowd, then landed on Emily with an expression Ruth couldn't quite read. "Hello, Emily," Vera said softly. The girl said nothing, just gripped Ruth's hand tighter. "Mrs. Holloway," Thomas said carefully, "I don't know what you think you're doing here, but I'm here to stop a travesty." Vera's voice carried across the grove with practiced authority. "My granddaughter is about to watch her mother marry a man who is not her father, in a ceremony that mocks everything sacred about family and marriage. That's not your decision to make," Ruth said, finding her voice. "As Emily's grandmother and closest blood relative with means to provide for her, I have every legal right to petition for custody if I believe the child is being raised in an unfit environment." The words landed like grenades. The man in the gray suit stepped forward, opening his briefcase. "I'm Richard Thornton, attorney at law. I have preliminary custody papers right here, signed by Mrs. Holloway, and ready to be filed with the family court on Monday morning." He held up a sheaf of documents, official and damning. "You can't do this," Ruth breathed. "I can and I will," Vera said, "unless you agree to cancel this wedding and return Emily to proper supervision." The crowd erupted in protest, voices overlapping, shouting denials and curses, but Vera raised her hand and they fell silent, responding to a lifetime of conditioned authority. "Yeah, I am offering you a choice, Ruth. Maintain your dignity, raise your daughter properly, and I'll overlook this embarrassing episode. Or marry this mechanic and spend the next year fighting me in court for custody while I drain every penny you have on legal fees you can't afford." Ruth looked at Emily's face, pale with confusion and rising fear, then at James, whose expression had gone dark with helpless rage, then at Thomas Webb, who was watching Vera with the cold assessment of a man calculating odds. "You don't want custody of that child," Thomas said quietly. Vera turned to him. "Excuse me." "You heard me. You don't want her. You've ignored her existence for 5 years. Never sent a birthday card, never called, never acknowledged her. And now you show up with lawyers and threats?" He shook his head. "This isn't about Emily's welfare. This is about control." "How dare you?" "I dare because I've seen your type before. People who use family as weapons when they can't get what they want through kindness." Thomas took a step closer. "What are you really here for, Mrs. Holloway?" For the first time, Vera's composure cracked. Her eyes shifted to Pritchard, then back to Thomas. And Ruth understood. "The church," she said aloud. "You're here because of the church, because we embarrassed Reverend Pritchard, because we made him look cruel in front of the entire town." Pritchard's face flushed. "This has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it." Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Vera Holloway, I've known you for 30 years. You've never shown the slightest interest in that child. But Dale Pritchard is your pastor, and his pride got wounded today. So here you are doing his dirty work. I am protecting my granddaughter from a morally compromised environment. Then where were you when Ruth was living above the hardware store with no heat in winter?" Bobby Chen called out. "Where were you when Emily needed new shoes and Ruth was working double shifts to afford them? Where were you when that baby was born?" One of the nurses from the county hospital added. "Because I was there. I was in the delivery room, and Ruth came in alone. No family, no support. Just a scared 23-year-old girl whose boyfriend died in a war and whose in-laws abandoned her." Vera's mouth opened and closed, but no words came. Emily, who'd been silent throughout this exchange, suddenly pulled away from Ruth and walked toward her grandmother. The crowd held its collective breath. The girl stopped 3 feet away, looking up at Vera with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "You're mean," Emily said simply. "You made my mama cry before I was born. She told me the story, and now you're trying to make her cry again." Vera stared down at her granddaughter, something flickering behind her eyes. Shame, maybe, or regret. "Emily, my mama is good, and James is good, and they love each other. And if you can't see that, then you're not very smart." The girl turned and walked back to Ruth, who caught her in a fierce embrace. James knelt beside them both. "Emily, that was very brave." "I don't like her," Emily whispered. "That's okay. You don't have to." Thomas turned back to Vera and Pritchard. "You've had your say. Now I'll have mine. This is my property. You came here uninvited, disrupted a private ceremony, and threatened a woman and child under my protection. I'm giving you 30 seconds to get back in your vehicles and leave. After that, I'm calling Sheriff Watkins and pressing trespassing charges. You can't. 25 seconds. Pritchard moved toward Thomas, his face purple with rage. "You think you can defy the church? Defy God's will?" "I think I can tell the difference between God's will and your ego." Thomas didn't raise his voice, but somehow it carried more weight than any shout. 20 seconds. The man in polyester, the hired muscle, took a step forward, but Ed Kowalski and 3 other farmers moved to flank Thomas. The math became very clear very quickly. 15 seconds. Vera looked at Emily one more time. The girl stared back with absolute judgment. "This isn't over," Vera said finally. "Yes," Ruth replied, her voice steady as stone. "It is. You made your choice 5 years ago. You don't get to unmake it now because it's convenient." Vera Holloway turned and walked back to the black sedan with as much dignity as she could salvage. The attorney followed, briefcase clutched to his chest. The muscle climbed into the passenger seat. Pritchard stood alone for a moment, staring at the assembled crowd, at the farmers and nurses and shopkeepers who'd chosen Ruth's side over his authority. "You're making a mistake," he said to no one in particular. "No," Mrs. Henderson replied. "We're witnessing a wedding. You're the one making a mistake by trying to stop it." Deputy Crenshaw, who'd remained silent throughout the confrontation, cleared his throat. "Reverend, we should go. This is getting out of hand." "Out of hand?" Pritchard spun on him. "These people are standing on private property, celebrating a legal marriage, breaking no laws." Crenshaw's voice was quiet but firm. "Sir, I was wrong this morning. About the arrest, about the bail amount, about all of it. Sheriff Watkins already told me he's recommending I be transferred back to Macon." He looked at Ruth. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. For what it's worth." Ruth nodded once. Crenshaw got back in the patrol car and drove away, leaving Pritchard standing alone in the dust. The Reverend looked at Thomas Webb one final time. "You'll regret this." "Maybe, but not today." Pritchard climbed into his Cadillac and followed the other vehicles down the gravel drive. The silence that followed their departure was profound, broken only by the cicadas and the distant sound of a dog barking somewhere across the fields. Then someone started clapping. Mrs. Henderson. Then Margaret Kowalski joined her. Then Ed. Then Bobby Chen. Then the nurses. Then the farmers, until the entire grove erupted in applause that sent birds scattering from the pecan branches overhead. Ruth stood in the center of it all, holding her daughter, feeling James's arm around her shoulders, and understood that they'd just fought and won a battle most people never even knew was being waged. The battle to be seen as human, as worthy, as enough. Thomas raised his hands for quiet. "I believe we have a wedding to conduct. If everyone would take their seats." The guests settled into their chairs, with the satisfied rustle of people who'd witnessed something important. Ruth walked down the aisle for the second time that day, past the same faces, through the same dappled light, but everything felt different now. Lighter, freer, true. She reached James at the altar, and he took both her hands in his. "You ready?" he whispered. "I've been ready for 5 years." Thomas Webb, who'd saved her wedding and stood against the church and offered his farm and his protection without asking anything in return, opened a small prayer book and began to speak. Dearly beloved, Thomas Webb had never officiated a wedding in his life. He'd watched his own 26 years ago in a small chapel outside Athens, had stood as best man for 2 cousins and a childhood friend, but he'd never been the one holding the book and speaking the words that bound 2 lives together. Yet here he stood, under the pecan trees his grandfather planted, reading from a prayer book his late wife had kept on her nightstand, presiding over a ceremony that felt less like a formality and more like an act of defiance against every force that had tried to break these 2 people. "Marriage," he read, his voice carrying clearly through the grove, "is not merely a legal contract or social convention. It is a covenant, a promise made in the presence of witnesses spoken aloud so that the world cannot deny it was said. Ruth and James stood before him, hands clasped, wedding rings waiting in Emily's careful grip. The afternoon sun filtered through the branches, painting them in light and shadow. Ruth Holloway, do you take James Monroe to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? Ruth looked at James, really looked at him, seeing not just the mechanic with grease-stained hands and a good heart, but the man who'd fixed her car and stayed to fix her life, who'd played tea party with Emily on Sunday afternoons, who'd proposed in her kitchen with flour on his shirt because they'd been baking cookies together, who'd sat in a jail cell rather than abandon her, even when the easy choice would have been to walk away from all this complication. "I do," she said. Her voice didn't waver. "James Monroe, do you take Ruth Holloway to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" James squeezed Ruth's hands gently. 6 months ago, he'd been a bachelor living above his repair shop, eating TV dinners and wondering if he'd die alone. Then a woman in a broken-down Chevy Nova had changed everything. Her quiet strength, her fierce love for her daughter, her refusal to be diminished by other people's judgment. He'd fallen in love with her resilience first, then her laugh, then the way she hummed while washing dishes, unconscious and off-key and perfect. "I do," he said. Emily stepped forward with the rings on a small white pillow Mrs. Henderson had produced from somewhere. The girl's face was solemn with the weight of responsibility. "The rings," Thomas said, "are a symbol of promises unbroken. Circles with no end. Love that doesn't quit." James took Ruth's ring, a simple gold band that had cost him 2 weeks' wages, and slid it onto her finger. "With this ring, I thee wed." Ruth took James's ring, slightly thicker, slightly heavier, and placed it on his hand. "With this ring, I thee wed." Thomas closed the prayer book. "Then by the power vested in me by—" He paused, smiled slightly. "By absolutely nobody official, but witnessed by every person standing here who believes in your love and your right to choose it. I pronounce you husband and wife." He looked at James. "You may kiss your bride." James pulled Ruth close and kissed her like he'd been waiting his entire life for permission. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, and somewhere in the chaos, Emily squealed with delight, and the Kowalski boys wolf-whistled until their mother told them to hush. When they finally broke apart, Ruth was crying again. But these were different tears. Clean tears, happy tears, the kind that washed away shame instead of drowning in it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. James Monroe." More applause, more cheering. Mrs. Henderson was openly weeping into her handkerchief, while her husband, who'd arrived late but in time for the vows, patted her shoulder awkwardly. The reception happened organically, without planning or coordination. Someone produced a record player and extension cord. Someone else brought out folding tables from Thomas's barn. Casseroles and pies appeared from car trunks, the universal currency of Southern celebration. And within 20 minutes, the pecan grove had transformed into an impromptu feast. Ruth danced with James to "Stand By Me," while Emily twirled nearby with the other children. She danced with Thomas to Unchained Melody, thanking him in whispered words that couldn't possibly convey the depth of her gratitude. She danced with Ed Kowalski, with Bobby Chen, with old Mr. Patterson, who shuffled carefully but smiled the entire time. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold, Ruth found herself standing at the edge of the grove watching the celebration continue without her. Thomas joined her, holding 2 glasses of sweet tea someone had brought. "You did a good thing today," Ruth said quietly. "We all did." "No, you started it. When you stood up to Pritchard at the church. When you offered your farm. When you went to get James from jail." She turned to look at him. Why? Really why? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the light change through the pecan branches. "My wife Sarah and I, we tried for years to have children. 3 miscarriages. The doctors said it wasn't safe to keep trying. We accepted it, or I thought we had. But after she died, I found a journal she'd kept. She wrote about the babies we lost, gave them names, drew pictures of what they might have looked like." His voice caught. And in the last entry, dated a week before the cancer took her, she wrote, "I wish I could have left Thomas with a child to love. Someone to carry forward all the good that's in him. But maybe that's not how it works. Maybe family isn't just blood. Maybe it's the people you choose to protect." He looked at Ruth. "You and Emily, you needed protecting today. And for the first time since Sarah died, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just surviving. Does that make sense?" Ruth's throat was too tight to speak, so she just nodded. They stood together in companionable silence, watching James lift Emily onto his shoulders so she could reach the pecan branches, watching the guests laugh and eat and celebrate the small miracle of love, persisting against opposition. "What happens on Monday?" Thomas asked. "When Vera Holloway files those custody papers?" "We fight them. James and I talked about it. We'll get a lawyer, even if we have to go into debt. We'll show the court that Emily is loved and safe and thriving." Ruth's voice was steady. "And if we lose, which we won't, but if we do, at least we'll have fought for her. At least she'll know we never gave up." "You won't lose." "How can you be sure?" "Because I'll testify, and so will everyone here. And any judge who looks at the evidence, really looks at it, will see that Emily belongs with you." Ruth hoped he was right, prayed he was right. As darkness fell and fireflies began their evening dance among the pecan trees, someone lit kerosene lanterns and hung them from the branches. The soft light transformed the grove into something magical, a pocket of warmth and joy carved out of a world that had tried very hard to deny it existed. James found Ruth at the edge of the celebration and pulled her into his arms. "Hey, Mrs. Monroe." The name sent a thrill through her. "Hey yourself, Mr. Monroe. You tired?" "Exhausted. Happiest I've ever been." Both at the same time. He kissed her forehead. "We should probably leave soon. Honeymoon suite at the Valdosta Motor Lodge awaits. Mrs. Henderson already volunteered to watch Emily tonight." "One more minute," Ruth said, wanting to hold on to this moment a little longer. "Just one more." They swayed together in the lantern light, not really dancing, just existing in the same space with the same heartbeat. Around them, the celebration continued. Children chasing fireflies, adults sharing stories, the record player cycling through songs nobody had chosen, but everyone knew. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the grove, the world waited with its judgments and complications and inevitable sorrows. But not yet. Not tonight. Tonight belonged to them. The Monroe family would face Vera Holloway in court 6 weeks later. The custody challenge would be dismissed after 15 minutes of testimony, the judge noting dryly that Grandparents who waited 5 years to demonstrate interest in a child's welfare cannot suddenly claim urgency. Reverend Dale Pritchard would resign from First Baptist Church 3 months after the wedding, citing health reasons, though the congregation understood it was really about the 147 members who'd left to form a new church, one that held its first service in Thomas Webb's pecan grove. Deputy Crenshaw would indeed transfer back to Macon, where he'd spend the next 30 years as a traffic cop, never rising above his current rank. And Ruth and James Monroe would stay in Valdosta, raising Emily and eventually 2 more children in a house they'd buy with help from a loan co-signed by Thomas Webb. But all of that was still to come. On this August evening in 1978, under the pecan trees in the fading light, all that mattered was the moment, and the promise, and the love that refused to quit. They say that on humid August nights, if you drive past the old Webb farm, now a community center run by Emily Monroe Kowalski, you can still hear music drifting through the pecan grove. The echo of a wedding that became a revolution, one vow at a time. If this story moved you, leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And subscribe for more true stories of ordinary people doing extraordinary things when the world says no. 20 years is long enough for a story to become legend, but not long enough to forget the truth. Ruth Monroe stood in Thomas Webb's pecan grove on the first Saturday in August 2008, watching her daughter Emily, now 24, now married herself, now 6 months pregnant, walk among the trees with her husband David. The grove looked different than it had 2 decades ago. The trees were taller, their canopies thicker. The grass had been worn down by countless feet over countless gatherings. A permanent pavilion stood where the makeshift altar once was, built by volunteers 5 years after that first wedding, when the community decided this place needed to be preserved. Thomas was 76 now, his hair white as cotton, his hands more gnarled but still strong. He stood beside Ruth, both of them watching the young couple with the quiet satisfaction of people who'd helped build something that lasted. "She's having a girl," Ruth said softly. "I heard. Congratulations, Grandma." The words still felt strange and wonderful. James emerged from the farmhouse, Thomas's farmhouse, where the Monroes had been coming for Sunday dinners for 20 years, carrying a tray of lemonade. At 54, he moved a little slower. His hair shot through with gray, but his smile was the same one that had made Ruth's heart skip in 1978. "Speech time?" he asked, setting down the tray. "In a minute. Let them have their moment." Around them, the grove was filling with people. Not for a wedding this time, but for the 20th anniversary celebration of the wedding that had become a turning point for Valdosta. Mrs. Henderson had passed 3 years ago, but her daughter had come, carrying on the family flower business. The Kowalskis were here, Ed retired now, Margaret still fierce and kind in equal measure. Bobby Chen, who'd sold the hardware store but still lived above it out of habit, and others. Younger faces who'd heard the story secondhand, who'd grown up in a Valdosta that was slightly different, slightly kinder, because of what had happened in this grove. Charlotte Williamson approached Ruth, walking with a cane but still sharp-eyed and observant. "I brought something," she said, pulling a yellowed newspaper clipping from her purse. The Valdosta Daily Times, dated August 13th, 1978. Local wedding becomes community rallying point. Ruth read the article for the first time in years. The reporter's account of the church rejection, the jail arrest, the pecan grove ceremony. It ended with a quote from Thomas Webb. "Sometimes love requires witnesses, people willing to stand up and say, 'This is right, this is good, This is worth protecting. I saved it, Charlotte said. Thought Emily might want it for her baby book, a reminder of where she comes from. Ruth folded the clipping carefully. Thank you. As the afternoon wore on, people shared memories. Ed Kowalski told the story of loading chairs from the church, embellishing it slightly each time he retold it. One of the hospital nurses, retired now, talked about delivering Emily and seeing Ruth come back years later with James, transformed from that scared young mother into someone settled and strong. Thomas eventually stood and asked for quiet. 20 years ago, he began. This grove hosted a wedding that probably should have happened in a church, but it didn't, and I think that worked out fine. Gentle laughter rippled through the crowd. What I remember most about that day wasn't the conflict or the drama. It was the moment when everyone in that church parking lot had to make a choice. Stand with judgment or stand with love. And one by one, you chose love. He looked at Ruth and James. You two taught this town something important. That worthiness isn't determined by other people's rules. That family is what you build, not what you're given. That grace is a verb, not a concept. Emily stood up, her hand resting on her swollen belly. I want to say something. Ruth felt her heart clench with pride and love. I was 4 years old that day, Emily said. I don't remember all of it, but I remember standing on church steps, feeling like we'd done something wrong, like we were being punished for existing. She looked around at the assembled faces, and then I remember people I barely knew showing up to protect us. Farmers and shopkeepers and strangers who decided that what was happening wasn't right. You all gave me my family. You gave me the chance to grow up feeling safe and loved instead of ashamed. Her voice caught. And now I'm about to have a daughter of my own, and I'm going to tell her about this place, about the people who stood up when it mattered, about how a community saved a wedding and built something better in the process. She turned to Thomas. And about the farmer who started it all by refusing to let cruelty win. Thomas wiped his eyes quickly, pretending it was the sun. As evening fell and the lanterns were lit, real permanent fixtures now, installed by the county after the grove became an official community space, Ruth found herself alone with James for a moment. 20 years, she said. Can you believe it? Best 20 years of my life. Even with all the chaos, the court battles, the gossip, the struggle. Especially because of all that. James pulled her close. Easy love doesn't teach you anything. But the kind we fought for? That kind shows you what you're made of. They swayed together in the lantern light, just like they had 2 decades ago, while around them their daughter laughed and their friends celebrated, and the pecan trees stood witness to a love that had refused to quit. Somewhere in town, in churches and offices and homes, there were probably still people who thought what happened in 1978 was wrong, who believed Ruth had been unworthy, that Pritchard had been right, that the old rules should have held. But they weren't here. And the people who were here, the people who mattered, they knew better. They'd watched Ruth and James build a marriage that lasted, raise children who were kind, contribute to a community that was stronger for their presence. And they'd learned that sometimes the most sacred spaces aren't found in buildings with steeples and stained glass. Sometimes they're found in pecan groves under open sky, where ordinary people do extraordinary things, where love wins. Not because it's easy, but because people refuse to let it lose. Some say if you drive past the Webb Community Center on summer evenings when weddings are held there, and there are many now, all kinds of weddings that might not have been welcome elsewhere, you can still feel the echo of that first ceremony. The ghost of a revolution that started with one woman on church steps and one farmer who wouldn't walk past someone in need. They say the grove remembers, and maybe in the way that matters most, it does. If stories like this remind you why community matters, drop a comment and share your own moment when someone stood up for you, or when you stood up for someone else. Hit subscribe for more true stories about ordinary courage changing everything, because every revolution starts with someone saying, "Not on my watch. Not today."